Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next panel on strategies for new budget realities. I'm Susan Charnow-Grier from the Washington office of McKinsey & Company, and very excited to have you all here today. In this next session, we're going to be talking about what can we do. We know budgets are getting cut, and we have to be realistic about it. This is something that is never fun to talk about, and certainly not fun to do. But in our work with government and business clients around the world, we've seen that, yes, it can be done, albeit painful, but the organizations that are the most successful at this are those that actually use these opportunities to find ways to become more nimble, more creative, right, and actually can take service to the next level. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panel, who are going to have some very tangible suggestions for what you can be thinking of for your agencies, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Paul Posner.
Good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We're excited to have about an hour to spend with you. We're going to have more of a conversation with each other about our collective experiences in allocating fiscal sacrifice, if you will, is one way to put it. I want to introduce our panel, which is really a stellar group. One thing you'll see when I introduce the first person at the other end is this is not just an inside the Beltway panel. We also have a leader of the state budget community with us because I strongly feel that in some ways the states have served as our canary in the mine, if you will, gone through 3 or 4 years of maybe the worst fiscal times in post-war history. And we can learn collectively in this room some lessons from what they've experienced. And then we have, so first I'll introduce Scott Pattison, and Scott is the former budget director of Virginia for 4 years, and for a number of years now has been the director of the National Association of State Budget Officers, and is really the premier spokesman if you want to know what's happening with state budgets and state fiscal issues. And certainly in this past 4 years, he's been a go-to person to help us all figure out what's going on in states that have, is it true, they've shed about 600,000 workers, state and local governments, all told. So while the private sector may have gained 1 million, you subtract from that the state and local jobs. And, you know, there's some differences, of course, between states and the federal government. One is they have balanced budget requirements. The other is they have actual bond markets that really expect them to adhere to those requirements. And we've so far taken a pass. We are, as someone said, the prettiest horse in the glue factory worldwide. We're not doing well, but we're doing better than almost anyone else economically. And so we're going to really be anxious to hear from Scott about the state's experiences and what we can learn from that. The second person is Lana who's with the budget director, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Transportation. Lana has been with the Department of Transportation for a number of years in various budget capacities and has led their efforts on performance and a variety of other management issues. And she's really one of the kind of leading people in our field. Lana also was formerly budget director of the Peace Corps and had her lineage starting at OMB, a great training ground for anybody starting out in budgeting. It's a good place to at least spend your young years. I'm not sure once your kids come, that's the best place to be, particularly in the fall. Finally, Todd Grams on my right is also a former OMBer. And Todd's had a very stellar career in a variety of agencies. He was the CFO and CIO of the IRS and has been also the budget director of the Veterans Health Administration, and now essentially is the budget director for the VA, the Veterans Department, and has a number of issues on his plate. So I think we're all going to have an interesting discussion hearing from these folks. I want to kind of first just raise a broad question here. You know, cutbacks are nothing new in budgeting, but I think the past several years have been pretty extraordinary in terms of the kind of pressures we all face at the federal level and certainly the states. And so basically I want to kind of ask those of you who are maybe first of all look ahead a little bit. We're looking at fiscal 2013 both at the states and the federal level. What choices do you see here for the coming fiscal year at the federal and state levels? Do you find these choices are going to become more or less difficult than the choices we've faced before? Is this more of the same, or do we really have to put on our pith helmets and prepare for the worst? Todd, you want to start off here?
Sure, Paul. The thinking about what we may talk about today and knowing 2013 was going to be one of the topics and how things are worse now than they were before, I hearken back, and Lana will actually know the individual I'm talking about if I named him, but I won't. This was back in 1983 when I arrived at OMB. This gentleman had been at OMB for 20 years before that, so he had started in 1963, and one of the best pieces of advice he ever gave me is he says, I can tell you what this budget year is going to be like before it happens. He says it's going to be worse than last year, but not as bad as next year. So that was 40 years ago. So I don't think people in our line of business thinking that next year is going to be the worst ever is anything new. I think our challenge is to, whether you're a budget person or a CFO, is to drive value, whether it's good times or bad times. And that means putting the processes and systems and people in place where you can do that, so that when the heat gets turned up higher, you can turn the dial in the agency a little higher. And while doing that, I think the key is balancing short-term with long-term, because if you're not ready to deal with these cuts when they happen, you get faced with doing things that aren't in the long-term best interest of the agency. And so I think there's got to be a balance of what you're doing. So if an agency isn't ready for what's going to come in 13, they need to, I would think, at least be putting two plans together. One is how do we get through 13 and 14 if we weren't ready for the cuts that are coming? And the other is what needs to happen beyond that. Because if you're dealing with kind of a fire drill, you're not going to have the flexibility and latitude to put the systems and re-engineer processes and make changes with your workforce that may be the best answer over the long haul. So I think it's balancing between those two. But again, striving for that value all along so that 13, which will not be as bad as 14, which will not be as bad as 15, you've got infrastructure there that allows you to deal with these issues as they happen.
Well,
Well, I agree with all of Todd's comments. I think one thing universally in my career, I've never heard anyone ever say this is going to be a good budget year and we're going to have more money than we ever knew what to do with. That just hasn't ever been how it works. But one thing to keep in mind is that you do have some money. You do have resources and you do have choices to make. And so I think really stepping back and thinking about where those choices might make sense, even if looking in areas where you haven't previously thought were touchable, is a very important thing to do. I also think it's really important when budgets get tight for everyone to realize the psychology that goes around with it. People in programs immediately contract. They get very mother bear-like about their programs. They don't want you from the budget office to know very much about it because they're sure you're going to be coming after what you perceive as a fat area of the budget when in fact they consider it very important. I think that's something we all need to be aware of in the budget cutting culture, that we really have that sense that goes on. And in fact, that's the very time you should be letting your budget people learn more about your programs if you're a program person. Because often, the more they know, the more they can help you protect the real mission of the program. So just when you feel like you don't want them to know anything is when you really want to take some time and educate them more about what you're doing. And that's a strategy I think we all need to work on now.
good. Now, Scott, of course, fiscal 13 is looking just great for the states by comparison.
Yeah, it is. and I do think folks should look to other levels of government. Just the reason Paul said it's a canary in the coal mine. States for the last 4 years and localities now for the last 2 or 3 years have been severely cutting. And it's a good way to look at how that process occurred. And what's interesting, as Todd said, that there are these fire drills that started the process. And the main reason was that our revenue crashed, and we have to balance our budgets for the most part, crashed when the economy went down. So it was almost immediate. So there was not a lot of time to plan. So you did all these across-the-board cuts. And the consequences of those were rather severe. Now you're getting into a period that allows you to do a little more strategic planning. And as Lana said, I think that it's real critical to start to think about contingencies. And there's so many examples of that at the state and local level of how they have started to say, and I'm sure folks at the federal level too, we expect either our budgets to grow more slowly than we expected, the new normal, or they're actually going to be cut. How are we going to deal with that? I'll give you a quick, this is such a simple example. I was in a state capitol the other day. I was talking to an agency head about budget cuts. And he said, you know, I have all kinds of contingencies. And one of them is we put out this report every year out of my agency. It costs $20,000 to print. And that's the first place I will go if there's a further cut. That $20K is immediately eliminated because we're not going to print that report. Awfully simple example, but already I realize what's good is that person was thinking already in contingencies about, okay, how do I plan for either a decrease in the increase that I have been expecting or actual cuts?
Right. Well, what kinds of, now I want to follow up on something Lana said, which is, you know, these are serious kinds of issues. You know, these affect programs, they affect employees. I want to just take one example. Many federal agencies are employee heavy. A lot of the budgets are payroll and the like. What we've seen, I think, from the state level is just an unprecedented shift in, you know, employee pensions, for example, and wages, and we've read a lot about the drama that has happened in Wisconsin and Ohio and places like that. Is that in the offing for the federal level? And maybe you can talk a little bit about how did the states wrestle with that? Because clearly that seems to have been one of the major strategies many states used. And are we facing those kinds of choices, those stark choices here with employees at the federal level?
I find it hard to believe as someone who serves states that that's not the case. And if you look at states, it's very interesting how it's played out. It's so much more a zero-sum game, at least heretofore has occurred at the federal level, where there is the ability to do the operating deficits at the federal level. We do not have at the state level, with the exception of maybe a California. So it's a zero-sum game. You've seen 41 states do significant changes to their pensions. Sometimes that includes raising the retirement age, raising how much they need to put in as an employee. The other thing going on, though, is you have seen layoffs and furloughs. That has been unprecedented even at the state and local level, but you are seeing that. I have many stories of walking up, Lansing, Michigan was one recently, to the door of an office building in the state capitol, and there's a piece of paper saying furlough days, Thursday, May 5th, or whatever it is. And so you're really seeing that, and you are seeing layoffs. And, you know, I have to say something that I find interesting, and I assume will occur if you do see cuts at the federal level, and that is there's the one place where there's a huge reluctance to go is personnel. That's the last place anyone wants to cut. I find it interesting because in some cases there are poor performers that even managers try to protect, and of course there are a lot of issues associated with that. But it shows how bad things become when you are either having to turn to furloughs or you're actually laying employees off, and we have seen that at the state and local level.
Todd and Lana, what's your perception on the kind of whole personnel issues as they affect the budget?
Well, I think we need to look at that, and I think the other area that's really important to consider is the impact on technology. Technology is letting us do all kinds of things in different ways than we used to do it before. We can now do some things that used to be very personnel labor intensive that we can, you know, rely on technology to help us with. I think those two things need to kind of work a little bit in tandem. You know, what are our real investment choices for the future in terms of how we're going to really think about what our capabilities are going to be on the technology side, and think about the kinds of people we're hiring in the stream, not just doing business the way we've always done it.
Yeah. Let me get back, and maybe Todd, you can take this one here first, is at the same time we're facing these, you know, fiscal clouds, and the states and the federal government are in the same boat as our local governments. We have this brain drain of retirees. We have the aging of the workforce. And we know we're going to have to replenish, God, we hope so. Programs like mine at George Mason depend on restocking your workforce with smart people. Is that going to happen? Are we looking at years of freezes and downsizing to the point where, what do we do about this workforce reinvestment? How do we achieve that? Are these incompatible, or what can we do about this?
I would argue, at least to a certain degree, we're there already. I don't know what your guys' experience has been, but I've moved around a fair amount in my career, and each organization I go into, sooner or later will sit down with the executive team and say, okay, let's map out our critical positions. Tell me for each position who are the 2 or 3 people in this organization that over the next 1, 3, or 5 years will be ready to fill each box on the organization. And the reality is I've never walked into an organization where 60 to 70% of those boxes can't be filled. And I am not overstating it. I think we're in the midst of the brain drain that we heard about before. The lesson I've learned about it is it happens quietly. There is no big boom, but you just see that if you're not careful, you find yourself pulling people up through the ranks or bringing them in 2, 3, 4 years before they maybe really should be ready for that next level of responsibility, and that has some risks inherent in it. I think our challenge going forward is to make the case that federal service is a good thing. And federal service can be even a greater thing when you need the quality of people that are going to help you through very, very complicated times. I mean, that's when you can give the most to your country. That's when the challenges are the greatest, and we do need the best and the brightest to come on board. I think we've got to get the word out of the great things that the federal government does, will continue to do. The opportunities are there for young, mid-level, and even high-level executives. I have never met an executive in my career who came in from the private sector, whether it was career or whether it was political, and after they spent a few years in the government, wanted to leave. They are amazed by how much federal employees get done despite all the rules and regulations. They are greatly satisfied by being able to overcome the challenges that exist in the public domain that for the vast majority of them certainly outweighed any satisfaction they got from hitting a bottom line.
Lana, do you?
I agree with that. I think one of the most recent experiences I had to kind of witness people really stepping up to the plate and giving absolutely everything they had was implementation of the Recovery Act. That happened at a time when our economic situation was a concern to many. A lot of people knew someone who was unemployed and very concerned about it, and their family members and friends. And they really gave much more than 40 hours, much more than 60 and 80 hours sometimes, to really help implement that act when it was passed. So that same feeling of, look, we're going to just band together and get it done is one I've experienced many times in my federal career. I think being a federal civil servant is very honorable. You learn an incredible amount, and you really are part of history in a certain way. A way that helps make sure that the institutions that we have here continue, and that's really very important. So I would certainly hope that you're going to be able to keep supplying a steady stream of good people for the federal government. I would say one real characteristic we need more of from our young people in the federal government is that of creativity, being really able to get out of the box and look at something, look at it from a different angle, think of it differently, propose some entirely new ideas. Those ideas need to be seated in many places, I think, in our institutions.
And let me add, Paul, too, kind of from a state experience, guard against the cynical view, because I'll be honest, in a lot of the state and local governments, because things have been so severely cut, you immediately have this attitude, if anyone brings up the brain drain issue, they immediately say, I don't care about that. I'm thrilled that people are leaving, because I'll give a good example of anecdotal. I was in New Mexico on Friday. I was meeting with the budget office there, and I was so fascinated that they had 18 people last year. They have 11 now, and they're doing the same amount, if not more work. That's the type of thing you're seeing, and unfortunately, I hope not, but I fear you're going to see it at the federal level. And I would really try to guard against, still do the planning and the succession planning, despite that attitude of wanting to fall back and say, I can't worry about brain drain. I'm happy that people are out of here because I've got to downsize anyway.
Just two quick dots that we were talking about, and that is the budget cuts and how do we prepare the workforce for tomorrow. Washington is notorious for the pendulum swinging, and we're at a real dangerous time right now between the budget cuts and some of the unattractive stories that have been in the press about some federal agencies where things are really starting to tighten. And I think it's our job as leaders to protect training budgets and make sure that we're giving the people the tools they need to do their job so that they can grow and not only do their job better today, but to do it tomorrow. And there's a real danger right now of the pendulum swinging too far and us being a little penny wise and pound foolish on giving our people the tools they need to do their job today and grow for tomorrow.
Yeah. that capital investment is obviously very important. Now, Scott, would you say that hiring has returned to state governments now? Can I tell my students they should be sending their resumes out, or are we still in the...
The way I'll answer that is there's stability in employment, so I don't think you'll see further layoffs. But I really don't think you're going to see significant increases in hiring. And frankly, outside of what I call favored areas, politically favored areas, which tends to be healthcare and K through 12 at the state level, I don't think you're going to see significant increases in government at the state level.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask about, since this is kind of, if we're not depressed by now, we should be. Is there a silver lining in all of this? In other words, does this force government to take a hard look at things that work and things that don't? And can we use this as an opportunity to really improve efficiency and make government, make the public more confident in our choices? What's your sense on that?
Absolutely. I think it's a no-brainer. It's the burning platform opportunity to push for change that you wouldn't otherwise have. But I'm just quickly going to go back to how I answered your first question, which is I just can't emphasize strongly enough, don't treat this as a fire drill, because it's either going to keep going now or it's going to come back later. And it is setting up the systems and the processes and the disciplines to always be looking to drive more value out of your agency. What programs are most critical to your missions? Which ones are performing best? Which ones aren't? And taking that hard look at things so that, when the storm comes by every few years, when the dust kicks up about the deficit, you have things in place where you can deal with it rather than, I suddenly, 18 months from now have to come up with some level of saving that can't be done other than across the board or some other quick way, which is not kind of the balanced way to do it.
What tools do you use? Now, we know GPRA was passed almost 20 years ago, and we have this administration's version of the GPRA Modernization Act. Has that proven to be of value as you kind of think about, thinking about what works and what doesn't, and how you can make that part of the budget process?
I think performance measures are very helpful in really focusing on what your strategic mission is and making sure everyone realizes the direction you're rowing in. But I think, building on Todd's comments, we also have to really look sometimes at collection of hard data that you really need to have in your back pocket for when you do have a moment where you need to deal with a cross-cutting situation. So you need to be able to be sure you know what you're spending on things now. I think a lot of time we spend collecting information that we haven't collected before. We've collected in the wrong way. We need to be smarter about the way we collect where we actually are spending detailed dollars. So when we need to look for cuts, we're smart about where we take them. And that takes some work. You have to build all that information. It's not there just because you wished it would be. Neither do you want to get every single piece of it by running an independent drill. You want to have systems that tell you everything you possibly can gather about your personnel system, your conferences, your travel, all of your operational areas. And I think we need to be smarter about the way we do some of that. Building on your innovation question, really, I think we really also need to think how will we be doing our work 10 years from now? Where will things be in the world of technology 10 years from now? And start paying attention to that, because to some degree, even in cost-cutting times, we have to think about investing in what we're going to need in the future. That's very important for us to pay attention to.
All right. Scott, what's been the experience at the state? Well, you said people start with across-the-board cuts and just kind of it's avoiding sinking. Have you seen in states a renaissance of interest in performance and making things work more efficiently and things like that?
Well, you have. That's the interesting thing. And cuts of up to 30% in an agency over the last 4 years are not at all unusual. I mean, that probably scares a lot of people in the room, but that's pretty common. And when you have cuts like that, it's amazing what kind of innovation comes out of that. Now, sometimes it's not always good consequences, but it's amazing the innovation, the creativity, and if that's rewarded, and some managers are good at rewarding that, you've seen some real improvements in efficiencies. And you know what I think of? I think of that show. I don't know if anyone's seen this on the Food Network. There's a fellow that comes into a failing restaurant and goes over the processes and says, I don't understand why things are laid out the way they are, and that type of thing. And I really think that is the type of thing that you've seen a lot of these agencies at the state and local level, is people stepping back and saying, we're getting a huge cut, and I don't want to lay people off. We've got to figure out how to do things differently. And so you've seen a lot of the administrative back office operations being done differently. training where they've had to cut, but they figured out we're going to do some in-house training or do pro bono training or just things that aren't costing us money. I mean, it's just fascinating to watch. In some ways, that's exciting. I mean, it's unfortunate that it has to occur that way, but it's the silver lining of these significant cuts.
How do you get, legislatures and program clients, how do you avoid them from just completely turning against you in this process? Obviously, that's a key issue. The more significant the cuts, the more fundamental the things you have to think about. Obviously, all of you have had experience with this. This is kind of the $64 question in budgeting in some sense. How do you, is there a magic formula? Is it just you have to tighten your seatbelt and be prepared to have the heat of reentry, or what's been your experience on doing this?
I think it gets back to a point Lana raised with her answer to the very first question, which is build that relationship, have that trust, reach out. If that's there, then I think you'll make it through reentry okay. If you're going into a situation like this where your budget or your CFO organization is already adversarial with the rest of the agency, then my guess is it's just going to get worse, and that's not going to be the best time to try to rebuild, because as Lana said, you've got the mother bear reaction happening there. And I just think it gets back to doing things right all along so that when things get tough, you've got the culture, you've got the system there where people can work together and try to figure out the problem, the solution to the problem.
I agree with that. I think the other thing that's real important when we kind of look at some of these budget cutting areas is to make sure that we're all very smart about our programs, that we really invest the time to learn what it is we're talking about so we understand where those reductions can come. Almost always when someone wants something else or wants to start a new effort, a new initiative, a new program, they come to someone in the budget office and they say, I want your help to get money for my new program. And almost always in their head, they're thinking about additional money on top of what they're already working with. I think some of my job is to look at all the money they currently have and help them find places where they can redirect resources to fund and support their new initiative. Because those new initiatives really breathe life into their program. They keep it exciting. They keep it moving forward. Always the solution is not, though, more money. And really just kind of having that dialogue is one way I think it's really important for all of us in these times to help us say, what are you currently doing with your money? Are you doing something you've been doing for 25 years that you've never really looked at before? Let's go into that and see if we can figure out a new way to do things. And there's really important ways we've changed the way we operate in the past few years. The number of times now we do training via webinars. We do video conferencing instead of travel, where we send a whole bunch of people to Denver. Those are very good ways to really cut our resources back, make sure we're still delivering the product we need, and are keeping in touch with the technology that's really going to be the way we're going to operate in the future. I think that collection of positives are very important. We might not have ever looked at those as alternatives if we were sitting on a whole lot of money and didn't have to make those hard choices.
Scott, what's the state experience been in this regard? Certainly we read about, large protests and things like that. That can't be the reality in many states. But what generally how have states kind of solved these more or less political problems in terms of?
Well, it's interesting. Part of it is not having any money. And it's interesting because it's so, people become so aware of that, you can't paper over that. So there's a more sense of realism. I fear at the federal level there's still a lack of that. And what I mean by that, not necessarily folks like you, but constituency groups and others, and I certainly saw it at the state level, that not an acceptance of the realities. So when they deal with, in this case, state legislators or governors or others, and of course members of Congress and the president and the administration at the federal level, there's this lack of realism where the officials are thinking, are you not seeing the numbers on the page? I mean, a real frustration. And what I know my experience in observing the states is what's effective is really that sense of realism to come in and say, I know you're cutting. And as Lana said too, the realism of not coming in and saying, I just want more money, and then the reaction of the finance official or whoever saying, are you crazy? Have you seen what's happening? More of a realistic discussion back and forth. We want to do X and Y So how do we do it? I really like your example, too, of a lot of states have gone through, let's say there's 7 big programs in an agency, and they've said, what do you not have to do? We're going to give it to somebody else. You do 6, and that 7th can be consolidated with someone else, that type of thing. And I'll just tell one story that I think is very illustrative of this. When I was in Virginia as budget director during a cut period, director of this program that helped sick children, which was about something that you can't imagine cutting, and they came in, they made a really good case as to why we shouldn't cut it, which we ended up not doing so. And then the president of a university came in telling us that nothing was more important than his university. And so immediately, without realizing it, this university president basically ruined his whole case because it was so unrealistic, because we had just seen 6 starving children, and we're weighing against this fellow coming in his nice $1,000 suit. So to me, what's really key here is realism about the financial picture.
This university didn't happen to go to the Final Four about 5 years ago, did it? Okay, I'll let you off the hook on that one. Yeah. One other thing that we've seen a lot of agencies face, certainly at the state level and the federal level, is uncertainty, and there's a tendency to procrastinate, as you indicated, when you're facing hard choices. God knows we've had CRs in good years and bad at the federal. How do you deal with that as a budget office, as an agency? Maybe from the states and the federal perspective. Todd, you, for example, have a 2-year budget for at least part of your agency. Has that helped ameliorate that problem? Or?
Without question, it helps. For our veterans health care system, which is how we provide medical care to eligible veterans in all 50 states, we actually get the budget 2 years out. So as Congress is enacting 13 right now, we're also getting 14. When they enacted 12, they enacted 13. So come October 1st, we already know and we already have our budget for the healthcare system. But I will say, I don't think there's a topic in federal financing that gets blamed for more stuff that could be avoided than, oh my, we are operating under a CR. We have had CRs at the VA, I believe, 21 out of the last 23 years before we got the advance appropriation. When that's reality staring you in the face, it's time to say, you know what? We're not going to have a full year budget on October 1st. We haven't had it for 90% of the last 20 years, so why don't we set up our processes and our planning in a way that assumes we will not have. Now, it would be great to have it on October 1st, and I know Congress tries to do that. The President sends his budget up, works with them. Every administration and every Congress, I think, have that as a goal. For some reason, though, it just isn't reality. So I think that folks in the programs and even in the budget office need to get away from that woe is us, we're operating under a CR, and put as many processes in place as we can so that we're not, for example, spending a lot of money in the fourth quarter because we weren't sure what we were going to get, and oh my, we can't spend till later. I don't find that in most cases to be a valid argument anymore.
Mm-hmm. Lana, you?
I agree. I think history has proven itself there, and smart budget offices know you have contingency plans on both sides, and you monitor them all year. I think that's very important. We are smart enough to know how to operate during a continuing resolution. It should not ever be a surprise, and we should be prepared for it. And if we're not, it's our fault.
Now, states don't really have occasionally prolonged periods, but you don't, not as a general rule, right? But you do have 2-year budgets in Virginia.
Yeah, quite a few, almost half the states. Yeah, it's interesting. California is an exception, and they tend to get a lot of media attention, so people often assume that's how other states operate. But no, most of them pass their budgets on time, usually months before the fiscal year, and that creates an enormous amount of certainties and stability, and you can do your contracts and other things knowing what kind of money you're going to get either for a 1 or 2 year period. What's really interesting, though, in the state experience, during the last 4 years, the first 2, there was a lot of uncertainty and instability because it was the recessionary period, tax revenue was coming down, so states were going back to their agencies and departments and saying, I'm sorry, I know we said you were getting, say, $100 million, you're getting $90 million, and then they're going back and saying, now it's $80 million. And we learned how awful that was for any type of planning. In the last 2 years, even though things are cut, we're still not back to the same levels the budgets were pre-recession. But the stability of that certainty is huge, with the ability to sign contracts and really plan for a 1 or 2 year period. I mean, it's night and day.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, I'll ask one more question, then we'll throw it open to the audience for comments and questions. Todd earlier was talking about the need to have what maybe we might call foresight, to think several years ahead about what you're facing and plan accordingly. Now, the states have just been through a horrible period. The states have a unique institution that enables them to do that. It's called rainy day funds. How do you convince a legislature that in a state that has been starved for money for 4 years and had major budget cuts to, as the revenues start filling the coffers, put this money in your rainy day fund instead of rehiring teachers? Is that does that become easier in state governments, or how does that conversation
Well, it's
work?
interesting because you think it would be really hard, because you're right, when you do that juxtaposition, how difficult it is. You've got teachers, we're just putting it in the bank. But there's a real culture at the state level, and it's really from the pain. The first real significant rainy day funds you saw at the state level started after the early 90s recession. And a lot of elected officials, a lot of legislators said, you know what, we don't want to go back. If another downturn occurs while we're in office, I don't want to go back and raise taxes and cut like we did. So let's put a little money in the bank. And it's really fascinating as I go around the country now. I was in Oklahoma City a couple weeks ago, and they were bragging about we're putting $300 million, and for them that's a lot, in the rainy day fund at the end of the year. So part of it is a culture, but I think it's a reaction to the pain was so bad, they want to avoid that in a future downturn. Yeah. So if you can convince officials that that's the way to go, it tends to work.
Let me just ask about another and see what your experience has been. We've seen some state and local governments, including the city of Chicago, start relying more and more on the private sector to fund capital investments and infrastructure and things like that as things get tight. Certainly anybody who's been through the Tysons Corner area in Northern Virginia can see that that section is being rebuilt to a ne'er-do-well thanks to private-public partnerships. Is that likely to continue? Is that strategy, as we kind of face more empty funds for capital investment, likely to be something that we would resort to more at the federal level? I know VA does some public-private partnerships, and what's the forecast for that kind of thing?
Yeah, we have been doing something called enhanced use leases for about 20 years now, and it has proven to be a wonderful tool for us to use. If we have land on a VA campus that we're not using, we will sign a 75-year agreement with a private sector company. They come in, they build a building on that land. They give us either benefits in kind or cash. At the end of the 75 years, the land in the building comes back to the VA. Over the last, I think it's around 12 or 13 years that we have the most recent numbers for, we estimate that the either benefit in kind, cash, whatever, the goodness out of this that's accrued to veterans has been about $250 million. So that's something that we're looking for. Our authority for this unfortunately lapsed in the last Congress. So we are working hard with OMB and our committees on the Hill to try to get that something like that restored. So that we can continue to leverage the underutilized resources that we have in the VA in a way that benefits our nation's veterans and their families.
Yeah. Lana, I know you have some of those
yes,
issues.
we do. We have public-private partnerships as well. I think our innovative financing tools are going to be a wave of the future as we look to take care of our infrastructure in new and different ways. Very good partnerships that are both private sector, local government, state, and federal, and I think that those kinds of projects really help us all learn a lot about each other and understand all those different approaches to government in a good way. I think a lot of good will come of it.
Scott, I know you were really at the forefront of Virginia with the Greenway, the Dulles Greenway.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is it's as simple as this. There's so much need for infrastructure in the United States, and there's not going to be enough money. There's not enough debt capacity at the state level. And I think you're the expert on this, but I think there'll be a declining amount from the federal government over time. And so it's basically as simple as the bridge won't get built if we don't do a public-private partnership and charge a toll. I think a lot of projects are coming down to that simple explanation. It won't happen unless we do it this way.
Mm-hmm. Does the public workforce, are they at an advantage, would you say, in dealing with the private sector, or are there some things that is difficult for them in dealing with the private sector and consummating these deals and overseeing it? What's been experience?
Well, the experience of states, and this is something that associations like ours have really advised them, they cannot assume they have the expertise to go against investment bankers and others when it's a public-private partnership negotiation. And so I know we have been very aggressive in saying, get the right expertise in the room. You can't assume you have it within government, at least within a state or local government, or you really could have a contract that is not in your interest.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. Certainly, speaking on behalf of all the MPAs throughout the country, I know we don't train people in private sector balance sheets, and so I think it's a universal issue as we move into this human capital challenge. Okay, well, let's throw it open to those of you out there and see what kind of questions or comments you might have for our distinguished panel. And who wants to go? Oh, this guy over here wants to go first.
Hi, Paul.
Tim, how are you?
Hi, everybody. Tim Clark. I just wondered whether Scott has seen, and whether any of the rest of you have seen, any real public reaction to budget cutting. Now, there have been over 600,000 layoffs at the state and local level. Class sizes are increasing, public safety services are decreasing, and things like that. You would expect some public reaction. And what about at the federal level? Has there been any public reaction to budget cuts, or the prospect of budget cuts, because many of the interest groups are looking at that? Or is it too early and people just plain aren't paying attention, and these budget cuts aren't happening in a serious way, a serious enough way at the federal level to occasion such a reaction?
Well, I'll just say, it's interesting you brought that up, because I personally have been fascinated by the lack of upheaval that these very significant state and local cuts have caused. I'm just personally fascinated by, again, there are agencies cut by 30% in a lot of states, and there has been very, very little reaction. Now, there'll be certain examples. For example, Arizona, you may have seen, cut for a very temporary period. They brought it back after an uproar, but they weren't going to cover transplants for those on the Medicaid health plans. And there was a public reaction, and they stopped that. But there have been some real significant cuts, and the reaction has been rather tempered. Another example on the other side of the spectrum from something like a serious health transplant is the incredible cuts that you've seen to the parks across the country, the state parks. I mean, if you go to California, you'll find most of them are closed, or they're closed just during, they're only open during the weekends, closed during the week. And I'm just fascinated by that. And part of the reason I say that, and that probably doesn't bode well to some of you, but I think it shows that there's a huge capacity for further cuts that may be out there without huge public reaction. But I can't say.
If I could add to that, I started my career in the New York City budget office in the mid-1970s, right before we had our fiscal crisis, and then during the fiscal crisis, which I somehow managed to survive, which was, talk about stress on budgeteers at that time. But it was remarkable because we were the home of every strike in America, and we were, garbage flooding the city for days on end, teachers striking for several weeks. The city was really undisciplined, and the politics were undisciplined. After the fiscal crisis hit in August of 1975, we could not sell our bonds. That's even worse than Greece. We had not one strike, and we enacted. And we never got serious until that time, and we enacted and implemented, we cut, we had a police force of 25,000, we cut 3,500 policemen, we had a fireman, 14,000 firemen, we cut 2,000 live bodies, these aren't positions. I mean, remarkable impact on a city that was reeling from recession and long-term dislocation of its economy. And I was always fascinated by that too. And I felt, boy, of all the times. And in fact, we got the unions on board to finance city salaries because we used their pension funds in lieu of the bond market. And it was just remarkable how the whole city came together, and it was what you said. When you have a credible threat of no money, it kind of changes the politics completely. And I'm doing another study of the OECD countries as they've faced fiscal stress in the past 20, 30 years. And one of the interesting findings is those governments that have steered their nations through deficit reduction to surpluses generally have had much more favorable re-election prospects than those governments that have stuck their head in the sand. Yeah. Now, of course, governments that have waited too long, like we saw this weekend, are getting their hat handed to them. But I don't know. Do you have any perception on your sense of, at the federal level about that, the public reaction and
well, I think the public pays attention to when it starts to miss services, and I think as services are less and less available, that's when people kind of pay attention to the reduction. Your park example was, I think, a good one. And I think at the federal level, as we see more and more federal services impacted, that will be when we'll hear more from the public about it.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's I want to be careful we don't confuse two concepts in black and white here based on Tim's question, and that is budgets can be reduced without reducing services. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like we're jumping right to the bone here. And I know in the VA healthcare system, we spend a little over $50 billion a year on veterans health care. In 11, 12, and 13, we have saved a cumulative $3.2 billion simply by being more effective and efficient. It hasn't always been easy, but we have done that, and we have done it without reducing services or benefits to veterans. So, hopefully we do as much of that as we can, but I don't think we're going to feel public reaction until you get to the point that Lana's talking about where services are actually impacted. Mm-hmm.
I agree with Todd's comments. I think we're all working very hard to work smarter in the federal government. Yeah. And we're all working with each other to find ways that have been successful so we can employ them in our own organizations.
Yeah.
But Paul, I do have to tell a quick funny story, and that is I was talking to a Western state budget officer, and I find this interesting, but I think it tells you the class reaction to certain cuts, because she said, we cut the heck out of all these services to lower income people, and not a peep. But then when I cut funds to the ballet, all these wealthy people were on the phone. So,
kind of like your story about the university before. Yeah. Okay. Who else wants to? Who else has a question? We have. These guys aren't going to cut your budget if you raise a question. There you go, Pat.
In the, could anybody hear what I said before? Okay, good. In terms of changes in the state revenue formula, the tax code, I mean, first of all, is that part of the remedy? And secondly, what kind of reaction have you seen in states, either from the public or from particular interest groups?
Well, that's another fascinating area. For an overwhelming majority of states, it is not even on the table to raise any taxes. And we can debate that. I always say at NASBA we're totally neutral. But that is fascinating, similar to the other thing. And it's related that they have really been able to do these very significant cuts and, with few exceptions, not raise taxes. And the populace, for the most part, has accepted that. Now, there are plenty of exceptions. There have been tax increases in places like California, New York, Illinois, and so forth. And what's interesting is part of it is threshold of pain. It's fascinating to me that a state like North Carolina and a state like Arizona, both very conservative for the most part, saw temporary sales tax increases, because I think that the populace was accepting of the fact that the pain would be so bad with further cuts, they accepted a tax increase. I think the one disappointing thing you're not seeing, and of course it's very, very parallel at the federal level, is most policy wonks, like Paul and me, really think there should be tax reform at every level. And you're not seeing a move toward any significant major overhauls of state tax systems. And of course, we have the same issue at the federal level.
Yeah. So would one of the lessons be that you have to plumb the spending side before you, and really hit bottom or hit bone?
Yeah, I really think that's the case. And you know, as you say, you get then suddenly when they feel it and say, wow, my state park around the corner is closed, or that health clinic that was vaccinating lower income people is closed, then it's easier to say, okay, we're going to have to overhaul taxes. We're going to have to increase taxes.
Yeah, good question. Yes, back there.
What do you think that managers can do to help retain employees? At the federal level, we've had a couple of years of pay freezes. Bonuses are not as generous as they used to be. What are some flexibilities that we can employ to help keep our best and brightest?
Well, I think we have used a few techniques to really help the workforce. Teleworking, for example, is now a commonly used strategy to help the workforce deal with spending some time writing at home on a regular basis or doing projects where they can be away from the office and deal with commuting issues. There have been certainly some benefits like that we've employed. I think the training by webinar is a very useful thing that we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from our employees. I think to some degree employees understand the environment we're in as well and realize that they too need to help be part of the solution. I think that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, I would just add to what Lana said is that, I mean, pay freezes are tough, especially on lower graded employees, and I'm about to say something and I don't want in any way, shape, or form it to be implied to say that isn't causing some hardship on some federal employees. But I think we as managers get hung up too much on that pay. Time and time again, decade after decade, studies show that the main reason people stay or leave a job at least contains two things. One, their boss, that is us, the managers. Do they like coming in and working with us every day? And two, do we help, do they know what their expectations are, and are we helping remove obstacles and give them the tools so that when they leave work at the end of the day, they feel like they've actually contributed and they've actually done something. And then third is just recognizing that work. And you don't need to, again, studies have shown that it doesn't always have to be money that people get when they're being recognized. Just giving someone some kind of public recognition for a job well done in front of their coworkers just goes an awfully long way. And that money gets put in the bank account and it gets spent. And you know, you can walk around the VA now and you can see people in their cubicles or the offices. They have little trophies, pictures, things like that are 5, 10, 15 years old that they still hold on to and cherish. So I would say as managers, we shouldn't get, again, some people are really impacted by that, and that has to be dealt with. But on average, I think pay is regularly down the list of what brings fulfillment and engagement to our employees.
Well, yes, right here.
You folks have talked about innovation in budget cuts, and I really like that idea, but I've been thinking for the past 30 minutes since you said that and tried to apply it to my agency, and, well, I'm having some trouble. We could stop printing things out, maybe, but I guess, how do you really execute a budget decrease, and how do you get people like it? Because my people aren't really liking it. We have equipment that you could apply cuss words to. Our facilities are almost unspeakably bad. You could probably get a union complaint on the facility itself. So how do I say, go forward, and you're going to have your same salaries for the next few years. Our greatest ally is a crappy economy. That's all I can say.
Well, I would just sort of share one thought that I think has served me well. I remember being at a party at one point, and someone just asking me what I did, and I said, oh, I'm a budget person. I really focus a lot on strategic planning because that's a lot of what budgeting really is. And the person responded back, oh, well, I don't have anything to do with budgets. I do policy. I do policy. And my reaction to that was, well, if you don't do budget, you don't do policy. They're very integrated in how they work together. And I think really getting to the heart of what your real mission is, what your real policies that you're trying to implement, and how that can work in a budget that you can take apart and put back together is really an important step. Even in really tough times, finding some initiative you can squeeze out that will give everything a little bit of new life is real important to try to do, redirecting some funds in some way. And it's very easy when you feel you're really in a tough spot to just kind of feel bad about that. But you need to try to get creative and find some way to kind of look at it differently. Sometimes bringing in someone else that isn't as close to the program to give you some ideas is useful. Someone from another agency. We can certainly all help each other by visiting each other's programs and learning a little bit about them and saying, well, from where I stand, this doesn't seem to be as important as all these other things you're doing. And that might be a strategy you might want to try. Go to another government agency, find someone in the budget office, and ask them to come and sit down and talk with you about some just fresh ideas.
Well, and let me add something that my experience, too, for the states has been real interesting. And I admit, it's not easy. I mean, rather than being in a Motel 6, I'd rather be in a Marriott. I mean, you know, it's very simple. And I've been into some state offices that I'm shocked by, and I'm sure there are some in the federal government, too, where, I mean, just terrible conditions. The cubicles are falling apart. It's just old equipment, broken machines. It is not pleasant. But the one thing that seems, and this fits partly with what Todd has said, the one thing that really seems to make a difference is appreciation. And what I mean by that is the employees who feel they're doing something important and made to feel that way, it makes all the difference. I've seen that at the state level. If they think they're just being treated shabby and not appreciated, it's one thing. But I know scale's different at the federal level, but there are so many examples where department heads demand that the governor walk through the offices of his or her department and thank people for what they're doing. Or they say, look, you work for the Department of Motor Vehicles, you are saving lives. You know, it's really and it's intangible and it doesn't always work. But where I see the dichotomy is where the employees are really appreciated and that culture is developed, even though, you know, the machines are falling apart and the curtains are falling down, that seems to be the difference.
Yeah. I would just like to add, I'm not doubting anything that you're saying, and if that's the way it is, that's not a good situation. I would encourage you as a manager, despite the current budget environment, fight for what your people need. I mean, literally, if your machines aren't working, fight to get them the new machines. You may not get them, but at least they know you're in their corner and you're trying to look out for them. But don't dismiss the little things, and this may sound silly, but when I was at the IRS, we used the Gallup Q12 survey of our employees every year, and it gets down to the work group level. And we had a work group that was out in one of my field sites in the Midwest. And I think, roughly speaking, their environment might not have been as bad as yours, but it wasn't much above it. The one thing that came out of that they wanted fixed was the supply cabinet had a lock on it. And they had to go to the boss's secretary if they wanted a pencil or a Post-it note pad, and that just ate at their very fiber as professionals, that they weren't even trusted to know how many pencils they should have at their, and again, that may sound silly, but that made, as soon as we got those results, those locks came off, showed that the manager there trusted the people, and it helped. It didn't make the Xerox machines work faster, and it didn't make the curtains brighter, but it did help with the employee morale and engagement because they felt like they were trusted. And just a very, very small thing.
Okay, one more question. Yes, right here.
Thank you. Quick question, especially in the states, but perhaps at the federal level, are there certain things that we're going to see government no longer do? Are there certain, I don't know, are we privatizing parks? Are we privatizing health clinics? Is that something you're seeing at the state levels or even federal level?
Absolutely. And one can argue whether it's good or bad, but it's already happening. As I mentioned, there are favored programs, both because of federal mandates or because of political favoritism. K through 12, healthcare tend to be favored areas. If you're not in that area, you're seeing huge declines. And I think state parks are the best example. There are many states they are zeroed out. Idaho does not provide general operating funds to state parks anymore. They are fee-based. When you go and you get a campsite, you have to pay a fee. Again, one could argue there are consequences to that, but I think that you're going to more and more see a focus, at least at the state level, on certain functions that they do. They're going to do K through 12, they're going to keep people in prison, they're going to do health care. But I think those peripheral things, conservation, state parks, historic preservation, whatever you want to call these things. And frankly, I think the big area, though, which is still in question, I think you're going to see a continued decline in state general operating support for universities. And I think there are huge consequences to that. But yes, in a very simple way to answer, absolutely, that's what you're seeing.
Yeah. Well, that's an appropriate way to end this, isn't it? I think that's the right question ultimately to ask as we go forward. Well, let me again thank our wonderful panel here for coming to talk with us.
You're welcome.
Great job. Thank you.